My screen is on you, Joyce.
My screen is you.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. My name is Michael Berger. I'm a program officer at the AVI CHAI Foundation. And this is a webinar that is part of a project the AVI CHAI Foundation launched several years ago, focusing case studies on particular aspects of day schools. And among the topics, the study of Hebrew, the teaching and learning of Hebrew in day schools was a very, very important topic, both for the foundation and the field. And 2 case studies were produced that we are going to feature today on the webinar. We have with us today Stan Beiner, who is currently a consultant to nonprofit organizations and schools. Previously, he served as head of the Epstein School in Atlanta, Georgia, which is featured in the case study Meshuga La Davar, Hebrew, by myself and Pearl Mattenson, which is available on the AVI CHAI website. Joining us as well is Rabbi Dr. Joyce Raynor, who is the head of school of the Dr. Miriam and Sheldon G. Adelson Educational Campus in Las Vegas, Nevada. Previously, she served as head of school of the Golda Academy in West Orange, New Jersey, featured in the case study called A School That Places Israel at Its Center, which was put together by Dr. Jack Wertheimer, who conducted the entire case study project. So basically what we're going to do is go in to invite our 2 speakers to share some thoughts on how to improve the study of Hebrew in one's day school and the process that they went through. And after that, we will take questions. You should have a little place on your screen to type in your questions, and I will be looking those over and presenting them to our speakers. So I now turn, since why everybody tuned in is to hear our 2 speakers. Stan Beiner, please.
Thank you. First of all, it's a real privilege to be talking about a topic for which I feel so much passion. And it's also great to be doing this webinar with a fellow Beth Israel Randallstown colleague. Now, some of you have had the chance to review the white papers provided, and I encourage you to read them, the full documents. Much of what Joyce and I are going to speak about is discussed in further detail there. I wanted to begin by providing you some context from which I'm speaking. I was head of school at the Epstein School for 13 years. When I arrived there, it was already known to have a focus on and a passionate connection to the Hebrew language. Pioneered Talmud materials. It embraced Hebrew proficiency in the middle school shortly after our transition began. And it was first day school in Atlanta to incorporate a trip to Israel in the 90s as a culmination of the Epstein experience, and also as an incentive for students to stay through 8th grade. Now, despite this outstanding track record for producing leaders and students who excelled in their studies, students who went on out of like 50 kids in the graduating class, there could be 3 or 4 valedictorians and salutatorians a year. Despite this record for producing excellence, at the time I took over, the school minimized one of its key reasons for success, which was Hebrew instruction. In part, it evolved into the Hebrew program over time that we saw, in which modern Hebrew language was the focus because of the commitment to modern Jewish community identity and a direct connection to Israel. And like many Jewish day schools, there was time set aside for integration meetings with the general studies staff in order for there to be a program that coordinated language arts, history, science teaching across the day. So the program was clearly defined, but there's always the lingering question in the minds of many as to whether or not the extent of the Hebrew program was taking away from the overall academic experience. Now, the school had 2 audiences. Those that didn't need to be convinced that Hebrew was of value. Your day school graduates, your Israelis, your committed conservative Jews, because this was a Schechter, children of survivors. But those numbers alone aren't going to fill all the seats in your school. So admissions had to figure out a way to downplay the time spent in Hebrew, but at the same time explain the value of Hebrew through examples of integration and graduate success, figuring the best offense is a good defense. So the question always came back to, how do you do it in half a day? As one board member once shared with me after we had gone through this process of change, she said, I always knew we had a great program, which is why I sent my kids there, but I could never articulate why. I just didn't understand how it worked. Now I do. And that is part of what I want to be talking about today. Now, to begin this process of beginning to take Hebrew out of the shadows, we engaged in a process with a marketing specialist. This is all detailed in the white paper. It's a great piece. I encourage you to read it. But for the purpose of today, these experts, after meeting with teachers, parents, students, community leaders, said to us, there are two things that distinguish the Epstein School from other private schools and from other day schools and from public schools. And that is, one, you have a phenomenal community, but two, Hebrew language instruction. You are a bilingual program, and you need to highlight those two items as game changers. And so we began the process of becoming a community of two languages, one community. Shtei Safot Kila Echad. And again, I won't go into the details of the process because there's a lot to it. And there are some pitfalls along the way. But in a sense, we clearly identified finally who we are and what we are. Now, the focus of my presentation is not to tell you how to change your day school into a bilingual model. It's to share with you the elements of success that are used to present Hebrew as a strength, no matter which model you're using. And there are several. It's important to be transparent. It's important to be data-driven. It's important to be articulate and passionate. And it's absolutely essential that whatever you say is what you do, and it can be clearly evidenced in your school. So what are the stages that go into the process of developing a Hebrew instruction model that's going to be effective, impactful, and enthusiastically supported by your constituents? So I'm going to go through the steps according to Stan. The first one is backward design. Stage one. Students schools come to their approach in Hebrew many different ways. You might be a religious school, and that's going to be the way you approach Hebrew. Zionist. You could be a community day school. You could be a small school that has limited resources from which is going to naturally craft what kind of program you put together. But whatever approach you have, it's got to be purposeful. And sometimes it's just evolved that way, but sometimes it hasn't. Whatever way it developed is not important. The point is you have a starting point. You know who you are. So using the UBD approach of backward design, you have to begin with the end result, which can be easily summed up with the question: what do we want the portrait of our graduates to be in relationship to the Hebrew language? And in order to achieve second language acquisition, there's an enduring understanding we have to have. And that is that the learners in this process have to understand its relevancy to the world in which they live. So that's the first stage, is you have to figure out who you are. The second is reflection and assessment. Answering the question requires the school to evaluate the success and the deficiencies of your current program based on what your ultimate goal is going to be. So it may even lead you to the topic of whether or not what you have is what you want. The conversation is going to require talking with all of your constituents, teachers, admissions, support staff, parents, lay leaders, and your students. How well do these groups know what they're doing? How can are they articulating the school's approach? Are they supportive of it? And however you choose to do it, discussion groups, meetings, surveys, it's an important piece of the puzzle. It's also important to understand there's no one right approach. Some schools are going to choose a bilingual approach, which requires immersion, it requires more time to develop Hebrew speakers. Other schools, most schools, choose a dual language approach, which they're not the same thing, but they both have value, in which Hebrew might be taught for the purpose of tefillah fluency, Torah, cultural identity. Whichever model is chosen, there's another element too, which is Judaic and general studies have to be integrated. The key here is define what your Hebrew program is trying to accomplish and assess where you're at. After you've done those two steps, really easy stuff, guys, the next step is alignment. So once a school has a clear approach, you have to address this. Is what we're saying, if this is this what we're saying we are, then are we walking the walk and are we talking the talk? And it requires a comprehensive look that includes a lot of things. And Joyce is going to talk about this more. You got to think about your staff training. Is it in alignment? Your marketing, your school visuals. How does your school look? Is there Hebrew in the hallways? Is there tefillah on the hallways? Whatever your school's approach is, does the school look like what you say you are? And in addition to that, you have to have your talking points, the elevator speech that you are going to make about Hebrew to whichever segmented marketing group you're talking to. You know, at the Epstein school, we had different talking points on the matter for Israelis, for non-affiliated, for Reform, for conservative, for Orthodox. They were all along the same line, but we approached it from a different way because people were looking for different things. So you have to keep all those in mind. And critical also, and I mean, even if you are a traditional Orthodox day school, that there is an element here that's important to address, which is how Hebrew impacts academic excellence on this as a secular component as well. Because that understanding is only going to deepen people's commitment to the school they go to. The good news is there is so much data, so much information out there now on second language instruction and its impact on brain development and the growing awareness of global education that you've got that information. When we started making the process, we have to thank Dan Pink for coming out with his book, which is a New York bestseller, which basically said, bilingual kids are smarter. Bilingual kids are more successful. Thank you, Dan Pink. It was perfect timing. Next element, curriculum. And again, Joyce will go into more details here. But you don't choose your curriculum and then decide that's your program. You have to decide first what your program is. And then think about which program is going to work for me. Will Talam be more effective? Would Netta be effective? But whatever program you choose, it's only going to get you partway there. You have to adapt it to your program. You have to make sure that it's going to meet your needs. But the curriculum itself, the program itself, that's not your curriculum. That helps you get there. The next piece is training. You have to prepare your staff to be able to teach Hebrew in the way that you want them to teach it, with the necessary skills. Depending on your money, you may send the whole staff to training. You may bring somebody in, or you may choose to train a trainer. But some way along the lines, you have to be giving people those talking points, even the teacher. The other thing comes to requiring is to what kind of staff you hire. Are they comfortable with the approach you have to Hebrew and Judaic studies? Are they willing to be trained to be effective in the model? Look, folks, just because a person speaks Hebrew doesn't mean they can teach Hebrew any more than just because I can bang a nail into a wall that I can build a house. You have to think carefully about your staff and you have to train them and they have to be willing to be trained. The other thing goes to the general studies. When you develop your program, your general staff has to understand the importance as well. They have to understand the value and benefit of being in that environment. The worst thing you can have is a teacher complaining that she doesn't have enough time for math because of all the Jewish things she has to do. And the last element in terms of alignment is making sure that your administrators, your key leaders, you are part of this process of transitioning from being practitioners of Hebrew to being language experts. You're the ones that are going to be speaking to new parents. You're going to be speaking to current parents, to board members, educating them to the value and doing ongoing education to the value and importance of the second language and how Hebrew instruction impacts a child both Jewishly and secularly. The last stage is marketing. Basically, it is making sure that this becomes your brand. It becomes internal to you. So to maximize the benefits of teaching Hebrew, you have to pay attention to this area. I know it's not education. That's not why you went into the field. But the bottom line is you have to fill your seats, which means you need to talk articulately and knowledgeably about this subject. And you have two markets. You've got your internal market and your external market. Your internal market, your parents and your teachers, they're the ones that are going to go out there. Word of mouth is more effective than anything you do in terms of a brochure. And then you have your external market, the people that are thinking of coming to the school. And that everyone needs to be able to explain how that impacts academic excellence. When you go to an open house, your general studies teacher should be talking about the value of being in a bilingual or dual language curriculum just as much as anybody else. The board needs to be able to explain the uniqueness of their program. The parents have to be able to share and brag about what their kids can do in two languages. Students have to be able to explain why learning two languages is an advantage. As a matter of fact, when the people came from the audit to talk to our kids, one of the things they said is, well, what's the benefit of learning a second language? And the kid says, it makes us smarter. So they had gotten the Kool-Aid drank pretty well. But that's important because kids saying that helps you solidify the work you really need to do, which is actual teaching of Hebrew. So a lot of you already do things like milestones, but you've got to bang them over the head and tell them why this is so wonderful that their kids can speak and conduct programs in Hebrew. And when parents tour the school, and this is my last piece on this, you have to make sure that they see in action what you're talking about. And sometimes you actually need to literally stage the visit so they will see this. So if they're going to a kindergarten class, that teacher knows at 10 o'clock, they're going to be doing something involving the integration of Hebrew and general studies so that parents begin to understand it. And the last thing you do is after you've done all this, you keep doing it again and again. That's part of the process. So in conclusion, ultimately, whatever approach to Hebrew instruction is taken, you've got to do it with passion. You have to do it with conviction. You have to do it with knowledge and background. And you need to have talking points that are backed up by data, evidence in action, and personal testimonies from the people who are impacted. None of this happens overnight. You can't start tomorrow. It's a process. But once you know who you are and where you're going, things will start to fall into place and Hebrew language will thrive at your school. So that's my piece. And I'm going to turn it over now to Joyce Raynor, Dr. Rabbi Joyce Raynor.
Joyce.
And she'll take it from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Stan. The good thing about being second is that I won't have to speak that much because much of Stan and I talked earlier last week, a few days ago, and found that we were really in alignment on many things. I just want to emphasize a couple of things that Stan said and then move on to give you maybe a different perspective. And the first is that, as Stan said, the very first point in all of this is to figure out what you want your school's program to be and what's the philosophical underpinning. And one is not better than another. Each school is different, and it's really important that you understand what you want from your Hebrew program. I believe that Hebrew is not sort of in and of itself, but it's in service of something larger. In many schools, Hebrew is in service of being able to read a traditional text and struggle with traditional text. In many schools, Hebrew is part of modern Israel, and for kids to be able to communicate with Israelis. It could be that it's part of a brain development, as Stan said, and kids are smarter. You have to understand why you're using Hebrew, what it is for, and then work from that. I think there's another thing that's really important that sometimes we forget about, and we have to ask ourselves, do I want to reflect my community, or do I want to lead it? Often we take sort of the consensus of what parents feel or what just seems to be the norm or the tradition in our school, and we do the best we can with that. Don't forget that you are the educational leaders in your school. You are the people that know best. Don't be afraid to lead. I do wear a necklace often that says, "Lischot neged hazerem." We are countercultural. We are often swimming upstream. And it's okay to swim upstream in this case as well. Stan was a good example of having done that. I think that it's very, very important that whatever you choose, whatever path you go down, you have to remember that it takes time. Stan said it doesn't happen overnight, and you can't despair. That means that we shouldn't be changing curricula all the time. Choose the curriculum that makes sense to you and stick with it. Students need the consistency, the teachers need the consistency, and we need to allow for growth and progress. So that if Hebrew is going to be a priority, you've got to be prepared to invest time, money, and human resources over and over and over. It is a long-term, it's an ongoing investment. It's not a quick fix. So you have to be ready to have constant interviews, constant conversations to make sure you're always hiring the best teachers. Just because your staff, your Hebrew staff is full this year, doesn't mean you won't need somebody next year. You constantly talk to people and bring them in. You always want to get the right people on the bus. I can't emphasize professional development enough. It has to be ongoing. It's not just that we send our teachers to, all of our teachers are going to go to Talam, to Netta, to this, to that, to whatever, and then they know it. It has to be ongoing, and in order for that to happen, each school is really well served if you have an expert on staff. Somebody who is a skilled mentor, whether it's a department chair or an administrator, someone who can support the teachers all the time and really work with them. And that person has to be really very, very good. And we need to support the mentors. We need to make sure that we're giving our mentors the professional development that they need to constantly do that. If we don't have those kinds of teachers, we need to start thinking about other possibilities. Do we look at online teaching of Hebrew? Do we look at distance teaching of Hebrew? I'm in a school right now in which some of our students are being taught in Jerusalem. You know, the teachers are in Jerusalem and our teachers are in Las Vegas, because that was the best way for us to get the Hebrew instruction that we needed. I believe, from the perspective that I come from, I think that we are most successful when we see Hebrew as a functional, useful, valuable language. It's, as I said, it's in service of something else. And I think that we can look at camps and other immersive environments and take some cues from that. We know how successful camps are. And that's because kids are living the environment. And that's part of our job as educators when it comes to Hebrew. We need to provide the immersive environment. The school that I worked at, Golda Academy, that immersive environment really came through the lens of Israel. And that's how we worked with it, and that's how we saw it. So, for example, I learned something by serendipity. We had always had a 12th grade program. Our students spend, our 12th graders, since the inception of the school 50 years ago, spend 1 week in Poland in February and then 16 weeks in Israel. Their entire second semester is in Israel. And about 10 years ago, we decided to add another Israel trip to our curriculum. And we added it in 9th grade for very specific reasons. And what we learned, what happened was an unintended consequence, which made us sort of rethink Hebrew and the way we do it to a certain extent. An unexpected consequence of sending the students in 9th grade. They start their 9th grade year in Israel for 2 weeks, and then they go in 12th grade. They went to Israel. A third of their time is spent with our partnership community in the high school, where they make friends and stay with those students in terms of home hospitality. They come home understanding Hebrew is really important. I'm going back in 12th grade. I need to know Hebrew better than I know now. My Hebrew may be good now, but it has to get better. And so all of a sudden, Hebrew became important. The students stopped fighting Hebrew, and they were on board with Hebrew education all the way. And so I think that that's something, I learned something from that. And so from that, we began to increase the collaborative projects that we do with Israeli schools and the twinning projects that we do with our high schools and our elementary schools, so that students are constantly using Hebrew in real ways. It's not just a class. But they need to know Hebrew because they are constantly conversing with their peers in Israel. I would say consider having trips before 8th grade and 12th grade. We tend to think of them as, I use the word reward, that may be too strong, but we use them as a summative experience. Consider using those trips as a way to engage the students and to have them understand that Hebrew really has a value of connecting with their friends in Israel or with other Israelis. Bringing in shlichim, bringing in shinshinim. Our school, both in Las Vegas and in New Jersey, has 3 or 4 shinshinim in the building all the time, speaking Hebrew with the students. All of a sudden, Hebrew takes on a very different message and a very different level of importance. And we learn from that. Hebrew should be spoken in the halls. It's not just something that we speak in class. The minute students see that it's important, it has value, it has usefulness, it has an important cultural connector. Music is important for kids, and food, those kinds of things. When they see how Hebrew works to connect those, I think those are very helpful. I would also say that you can think about what you do in other ways. Our school in New Jersey had an exchange program for many years with the Jewish Day School in Santiago, Chile, and many of our students take French, don't speak Spanish. Their students' English was very bad. Hebrew was the language of communication between the students in Santiago and the students in West Orange, New Jersey. And so the more examples and experiences that you can bring to your children and to your students about Hebrew being important, that's where they understand it. Again, in my school, it was about Israel. In your school, it could be about Tanakh and Talmud and rabbinics. It could be all sorts of things, but make sure that what you're doing, once you've chosen your path, the more that we can give the students experiences that show that fluency in Hebrew gets them where they want to be, then that's what success is. And success breeds success, so we always want to start with small wins and have the kids feel good about making that work and then taking them to greater and greater heights.
Thank you both. Before we turn to the questions, and I want to remind everybody that you can use a chat box on your screen to send in questions. I'll be giving the speakers a variety of questions that you've sent in. Quite a few have sent in already. But I also want to remind you that this webinar is being taped and will be available if you came in on a later start or you want to share this later with people who couldn't join us for this hour. It will be on the AVI CHAI website under the Knowledge Center, so you can find that under the case studies, and there'll be a webinar. This very webinar will go on the website literally the minute we finish. So you're welcome to turn to that. So I'm going to start off with some questions. We really have quite a few of them. First, I just feel for our audience, just somebody could clarify the difference between bilingual and duolingual or immersion. Just want to make sure everybody is on the same page because we actually have people internationally who are tuning into this webinar.
Well, I mean, I can answer that. When you're talking about a bilingual approach, you're talking about teaching in an immersion matter in which students are learning in that language for a defined period of the day. In addition, one of the main goals of a bilingual approach is to create people who have oral fluency. I mean, that's the last stage, but ultimately your goal is to become proficient in communicating, reading, writing, and speaking. When you talk about a dual program, the dual program, that may result, there may be some kids that are just that good that they can pick up a level of fluency. But for the most part, it's a familiarity, it's an understanding of how to use Hebrew for the express purpose of what their school is doing, learning, whether it's learning some vocabulary, learning a lot of vocabulary, but the purpose of a dual language program in unto itself is not to produce fluent speakers. So I would say that's a separate, but it doesn't mean you're not teaching a second language.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions about choosing an approach and sort of understanding the different benefits or the processes of picking a program. Let's Joyce, if we could turn to you. There seem to be a variety of, we have quite a few questions about the variety of programs out there. There's Talam, there's Netta, there's the proficiency approach. Could just speak about the benefits or the challenges of each without obviously advocating for one or another. So we'll turn to you, Joyce, first.
I would just say that when we talk about proficiency, and Stan may be able to go into more detail than this, but when we go into proficiency, that's not a curriculum. That's more of an approach to Hebrew or to any language. And so it's not, well, if we do proficiency, then we can't do Talam or we can't do Netta. Or we can't do Chavirim Bivrit, or whatever you might choose. So just understand that we're not talking necessarily about mutually exclusive. The question of, again, how you would, or the benefits, or how you would choose a program, I think, again, it comes from what you want and from what your goals are. Are you interested in having your students speak modern Hebrew? Is that the primary goal? Are you interested in having your students be able to tackle Hebrew so that they can read religious texts? And the speaking is really not important as the comprehension. One has to understand what is best for the school before you can do that. I think you don't have to be afraid of using multiple programs. I have worked at a school that uses Talam in the lower school and Netta in the upper school. They are very different, and yet once you have teachers who really know these programs well, you work together to make sure that the transition is a smooth one. When you choose a Hebrew program, for the most part, you can't do it all. You have to pick what works for you. Talam, Netta, the programs that Stan was talking about are very, very comprehensive. And you may only pick certain aspects of them, and that's okay. Chances are you won't be able to do everything. I work in a school now that is a very pluralistic community school. It is not a religious school. And so we don't use the part of Talam that talks about tefillah, for example, because it's totally inappropriate to the goals of the school that I'm in. So it's really about aligning the curriculum. I think there are a lot of good curricula out there. It's not that, that's what we keep saying. It's not a quick fix. It's not that if I choose Netta, things are going to get better. They might not. The curriculum is really the last step, the program that you choose.
Yeah. And Joyce, I can give an example too, which came out of our discussion with the audit. So when we were doing our audit, the middle school had been using proficiency. Now, again, proficiency is not a program. Proficiency is basically, the proficiency approach would be similar to what you experience if you're teaching Spanish or French in a typical public school or private school. It's teaching Hebrew as a second language. There's the add-on of the cultural and the historical. And again, that's where the teacher comes in with choosing materials that can further enhance the identity of school. But in itself, proficiency is not a model. And so our middle school is focused on proficiency and teachers developing their own materials. And in the elementary school, they were wedded to the Tal Am program. Part of what we came to the conclusion after the audit, where we said we need a third set of eyes here, was that we looked at Tal Am and said, we don't want to get rid of Tal Am, but we need the benchmarks. We need to be using the same language in elementary school as in middle school. And when we talked to Tova Shimon, as it turns out, Tal Am has a whole component dealing with proficiency that just wasn't being used. And so we began the process of working with extrapolating that, because we wanted to start doing OPI evaluations in the lower grades, and in a sense mirroring the same evaluation process for elementary school as for middle school. But blending different programs really isn't a problem if you know what you want to accomplish in the end. Our school wanted to accomplish fluent Hebrew speakers. So using both, because Tal Am has such a rich set of materials, and Hebrew proficiency says you can either create your own materials, but you could use other materials that are already there, but you have to do it in the lens of a modern language instruction program. You can't just go through the book. So these approaches, again, go back to the whole point. You have to know what you want first, and then you have to go through the supermarket of Hebrew language instruction and go shopping. And again, that's why it takes longer than just 6 months.
We have a whole bunch of very practical questions. So if you don't mind, I'm going to present them, and each of you could just take a couple of minutes to answer, because I really want to get as many questions in as I can. The consistency of teachers. When I talk about that, the question is persuading the teachers to consistently speak in Hebrew rather than lapsing into English. So either of you can speak to that? Okay.
That's just about, I believe that is just about constantly reinforcing and telling teachers these are the expectations. I think that it's helpful to find some teacher on the staff or a principal, a mentor, somebody who can train teachers to teach in easy Hebrew. And there is a skill, and that's something that can be done, because what happens is it's easier to answer in English because the kids don't say that they don't know Hebrew. First of all, they know more than they'll tell you. But besides that, until kids get to a certain level, there are ways to speak to them, particularly in the halls when you're not in a classroom, that you can get the message across in words that are, or in phrases that are different than you might need. So that's the importance of having a real Hebrew, really quality Hebrew department chair mentor, someone to work with the teachers to constantly push them and get them to feel comfortable doing that. It's ongoing work with our teachers.
And Michael, this goes back to the same piece again about staff training. If you develop an approach to Hebrew, and that approach, let's say you've chosen a bilingual approach, then for a teacher not to be speaking in Hebrew to their students all the time means they didn't get trained properly. That's like a given. You're speaking in Hebrew. So the fact that the teachers would flip back to English in that setting means that there's still a lot more training to be done, because students will learn the language through context, through all the little tricks you might use with your hands and with your intonations to get the message. They learn very quickly, but If you're in that kind of program and your teachers aren't speaking Hebrew, then they don't understand the program. You have to take a step back in the process and say, we're not walking the walk and talking the talk. What do we need to do to make changes? But that's just an example of you need more training. And your teachers need to understand why they can't reach success if they fall back on English when they're in a bilingual program.
Okay, thank you. Benchmarking. Quite a few questions are looking for help. There's a lot of support for everything you've said, but people are looking for ways to either find it or apply benchmarking for Hebrew language in their schools. Any suggestions?
Joyce, you want to go first?
Well, no, you can. It's fine. I went first last time. Go ahead.
All right. So in any, just like in any good curriculum, every year you have benchmarks that are supposed to be achieved. What? And this is where you have to look at Hebrew as a subject of language, not just Hebrew is part of who we are as a people. It's a language. So you have benchmarks, whether it's tefillah, whether it's speaking, whether it's reading, and it should be every single grade. And there needs to be a development of consensus. Personally, first of all, like you can get part of the way there depending what program you're using, but that's a matter of taking the people that are in those grade levels, talking about the benchmarks, and then laying it out with what is the ultimate goal. Like at the Epstein school, we broke it down and said, what is it that we want fifth grade graduates to know? And then what are eighth grade graduates supposed to know? But then breaking it down further is, what should a second grader be able to do in Hebrew to go to the third grade? Because you're building towards the ultimate result, the ultimate product. So this is curriculum at its basic. Benchmarks should be treated the same way as math. Even though you're talking about a religious, cultural, passionate connector. But those affective objectives can be put into it as well. But you must construct it like you would any other part of your program.
Right. And the only other thing I would add is that, yeah, it's understanding by design. It's going backwards to understand, to know what you want kids to know at what grade. But also I would say the resources to think about. Hebrew is Hebrew is a language, again, tefillah, and there are other aspects to it. But take a look at the benchmarks that a school would use for Spanish or French or any other language, and start with those if that's helpful. The other I would say is just the concept of benchmarks and standards. Many schools have gone through that process in Tanakh, in that program, and now in rabbinics. Use that same methodology. You know how to do it in other subjects. Use that exact same methodology for Hebrew as well.
Okay, the next question is about lateral transfers. A lot of schools take students either who move into the community or who move from a public school or another school that doesn't have Hebrew in the same way that you do. How do schools successfully address students with a wide variety of skills, especially in terms of transfer students? Joyce?
I think you have to build a program. Just as you're building a program of Hebrew for students starting in kindergarten or 3 years old or first grade or wherever they start, you're also building that same program for students who come in third grade, in seventh grade, in ninth grade, in whatever it is. They are going to be obviously different benchmarks and different plans, but it's not just, oh, here we have a class of kids who came, now what do we do with them? You need to understand what we want these students to know at the end of 1 year, at the end of 2 years, 3 years, whatever, and when we believe that we can integrate them into a class. Just because students started in fifth grade instead of first grade doesn't mean they need to be in the lowest level. They may be very good at language acquisition, it's just that they have no experience. So I believe that this is another, call it machina, call it ulpan, call it whatever you want. This is another program that you have to plan, knowing what you want and when you want them integrated in other classes and what you can expect from them from these students at different levels. It's not just catch as catch can. You don't throw them all in the class.
And the Epstein School had a very unique situation because of the fact that it's a bilingual program. And once it became very clear, the question was, because at a certain point in time, we made a decision that we weren't taking kids into the school after from like fourth and fifth grade. But in terms of admissions, that doesn't make any sense. So we went back and we developed something. I want to give, so not just me alone, but we developed a Hebrew transition program that had a different goal than it originally did. The original goal was to successfully, by the end of the year, have the students integrated into the regular Hebrew program. When we changed that model, and what we did was we knew if a kid came in second or third grade, we would put them into a Hebrew transition program that we knew because of when they were coming in that they would be able to, either by the end of the first year or the beginning of the second year, be able to make that transition. But when it got to like fourth and fifth grade, the reason why it became successful was we changed our expectations. Our expectation was that if the kid came in fourth grade, they may never enter into middle school. They may never enter into the regular classroom. That doesn't mean they weren't going to do milestones together. They weren't going to pray together. They weren't going to be integrated in those kinds of ways. But they had a separate program with the teacher who is continuing to develop their skills. Ironically, a lot of times the kids, because of their own motivation, wanting to change over to be in the regular part of the classroom, the mainstream Hebrew, they on their own did so. But there were other kids who were comfortable, and because they no longer had that pressure of having to move in before they were ready, we found tremendous success. And I know that one of the day schools in Boston borrowed on that model and created their own program. But a program that once you stop saying you have to have the same exact expectations, you can start transitioning kids in with less pressure. That's what we found. When it came to middle school, we started all over again. And similar to what Joyce said, we had a program for Hebrew for kids who had some learning issues, but we had another Hebrew program that was really designed for kids coming in early, for them to be able to acquire the language they needed, and they would move up through there was constant assessment going on, and transition from one Hebrew group to another, different times during the year. So, but taking away that expectation that you had to be mainstreamed by a certain deadline opened us up to a lot more fourth and fifth graders coming into school. It really was a game changer.
Thank you. We have a question about shlichim and shinshinim. How do we get this program or these programs to our school? So if you could speak a little bit about how you did that or where one finds those resources, etc.
Well, that's easy. You go to the Jewish Agency for Israel, otherwise known as the Sochnut, and they're the ones that sort of supervise the program. There is a program of Morim Shlichim, where you can have, I've never used them, but I know they're very successful in chat, so somebody could find chat in Toronto, you could talk to them, where teachers come over for 3 years as teachers, and they are shlichim, but they are fully licensed teachers. They teach and then they go back. There's a turnover every 2 or 3 years. Shinshinim are kids who are on a gap year that work with teachers, and so there are young shlichim. There's a whole hierarchy of shlichim. They cost different amounts of money. They have different skills and advantages and disadvantages. I would start with the Jewish Agency, with the Sochnut. They could talk to you about each one. Also, the World Zionist Organization is involved in that a little bit, and you could get some information from them. Or I have found them to be very, very useful in adding to an immersive environment.
Sam?
Well, I think Joyce can sort of answer it. I mean, it used to be different. When I first started at Epstein, we used to go over to Israel, interview people. There would be a line out the door to see if they could come to Epstein. We would train them for a year as assistant teachers and then allow them to become lead teachers. But with the change in legal issues, it's so much more difficult now to bring teachers to the United States you have to go through the agency. And there are several programs. I know we used one in particular. And when I was in Kansas City, we had a lot of success with Kollel. And there are other venues for bringing people to the States, depending on, again, your approach to Hebrew, your approach to. But that in itself is a big topic. I don't know if we can spend most of our time on it. Certainly having a shaliach in the school, from the cultural point of view, from the Hebrew point of view, is wonderful if it can be done. But again, much more complicated than it used to be.
Right, and the big complication is really the visa, which is why you're better off going through the Sochnut and get the visas for you. Otherwise, you can be in trouble. You can hire a teacher and they can't come.
Right, that's a very good point, the visa. More questions. Your opinion on tracking or leveling Hebrew language classes, both in elementary school and middle school.
Okay, so tracking for me goes to a little bit of a different, there's a philosophy attached to it. I think in middle school, look, the children's brains develop at different, on their own level. They don't all develop the same. So when it comes to certain parts of the brain, you're going to sometimes have kids that are struggling early on, but not so much later. In our school, we try to avoid tracking because the whole notion of like writing a kid's script when they're too young and telling them what they can do and what they can't do is just it's so destructive to a child. And we see too many times when, the predictions are all wrong and the kid is a brilliant kid. So you have to be really careful with tracking in general. But I do think that there are certain subjects where it's not fair to the kid from an emotional, in their own, how they feel about themselves. So in middle school, at that level, we would divide them up by levels. But there was a fluidity to being able to change groups. And there was also times during the year where the kids had electives, where they mixed with each other, so that it took a little bit away from that. The other piece in the elementary school, for the most part, unless a child had a learning issue and was in a modified Hebrew program, all the kids were in the same program. Some were much better than others, but we made the assumption that if they have the intellectual capacity, they should not be tracked too early on. By middle school, it starts to become a little bit different, and we were comfortable only in a few subjects. Math and Hebrew basically were the only subjects that at the Epstein school, we tracked, but it was only because of really that was a matter of brain development. It wasn't a matter of anything else.
Yeah, I am also not a fan of tracking before middle school. If you have, by any chance, a teacher on your staff who is, who in elementary school or lower school, who can teach lower school students, but also is fluent in Hebrew. I have worked with one or two. They were actually Americans, not Israelis. And the entire day is taught in Hebrew. Math is taught in Hebrew, science is taught in Hebrew, social studies is taught in Hebrew. Then you don't even have to have that tracking problem because it is clearly a bilingual education, and all of the kids learn Hebrew as they're learning math and everything else. That gets away from that.
Any recommendations? There's a question on online resources. We have quite a few communities that have one school, and they're far from other communities, and they're not necessarily so resourced to bring people in and fly them in. So there's a question to the two of you. Can you recommend online webinars or suggest links? How to teach Hebrew, or for the students or for the teachers?
In terms of the students, I've had some success with two different organizations. One is called Bonim B'Yachad. A lot of it is Judaics as well as Hebrew. You have to see exactly what they offer. And the other is, I don't know what this stands for. It's called JETS. Both of these are coming out of Israel. and we have used the JETS curriculum. I could try to get the, if you want, Michael, I could try to find that for both of them. I can get the contact information. I don't know who to give it to, but get it to somebody.
On our website for people.
Okay. We have here in Las Vegas, which we have that issue. We have used the JETS curriculum for third graders, fourth, fifth graders, and they are being taught with very good teachers from Jerusalem.
And
with 10-hour time difference.
Anything for teachers, professional development?
Online.
Well, I would say that in addition to the typical resources that come out of the Jewish institutions, and there are definitely some, we found some benefit also in going through ACFEL, which is the Association for, for teaching
foreign languages.
ACFEL has, as a matter of fact, that's who we went through to do our.
That's ACTFL. How do you say?
Yes.
ACTFL.
Yeah.
And that is an organization completely dedicated to teaching Hebrew as a second language. And again, I want to clarify something. You're talking about teaching Hebrew as a second language. That's part of the component. It does not in any way mean that we're bifurcating the passionate teaching of Hebrew and the cultural identity that goes along with it. But as Joyce said, because part of the process is you're identifying how children are going to find Hebrew relevant to them. So it's going to come in many different ways, whether it's learning how to speak Hebrew so they can talk to friends in Spain, which is what Epstein did when they went to Spain. The kids couldn't speak they couldn't speak in English. They spoke in Spanish and Hebrew in order to communicate. So that relevancy is important. So I don't want to take away from that. And that, look, when you teach Hebrew, as in terms of communicating with Bible, I mean, there's a spiritual piece to it that's there. So, but in terms of teaching that language component for those who have that as a goal at the school, I also look at ACFEL. If not for your teachers, although it's helpful, your teachers of teachers, your trainers.
Okay.
And also depending on what curriculum you use. For example, I have found the NETA trainers and mentors to be extremely open to working with teachers on the phone, on Skype. It doesn't matter that you're in Portland and they're in Jerusalem, or you're in Las Vegas and they're in Tel Aviv or wherever, or New York. They will put hours and hours into individual training. So I would ask those questions of whatever Hebrew curriculum you're using, because those writers and those developers are often willing to give understanding that you are kind of in an isolated position. Will give you a lot of time and training.
Yeah, I mean, that goes also to places like Talam, where they talk about multiple intelligences, and everything designed is based on on educational principles. So in proficiency, they go into a great deal about how people acquire language skills. Each one of these programs has a component that is big picture, which is important, because it's not about just teaching how to teach. You can't teach Hebrew until you understand how the brain works, how language is acquired, and of course, keeping in mind the goals you've set for your school already.
Well, I want to thank the two of you. We're really coming to our hour, and you've given so much information, so much insight, so much wisdom from your own experience, and for those who are on it, we hope other people will be able to join. We've heard about processes. We've heard about the importance of understanding values and leading, the critical role that professional development plays, and the patience and the time that this needs to take, but that it be thoughtful and reflective. Really, two of you did an outstanding job, and we really appreciate this. And we wish everybody a Shana Tova, Ktiva v'Chatima Tova, and we hope that it'll be a Shnat Ivrit, Shana Metuka, and thank you both for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.